So he was one of them. And the thing was, he was not on anybody's radar. He was picking up these women. He picked up a lot of sex workers, and some of these sex workers were on drugs. It's not uncommon. He picked them up, and he would, say, oh, we're going to have sex. Except, so they signed up for that, but they did not sign up for the kind of sex that he then proceeded to have with them, which was rough sex. Now, I'm just going to tell you the very basics so we don't go into the gruesome stuff. You could read that for yourself. But he basically learned used what he learned, and that is he would cut off their airway, cut off their oxygen by pressing on their carotid artery, and choke them out while he was having sex with them, and he did other things to hurt them while he was having sex with them. And then he'd bring them back with CPR repeatedly, and he got off on that. So he did that with apparently 50 women, but these 4 he couldn't bring back, so he said it was an accident. Well, okay, if you do this the first time and they don't come back, maybe that's an accident. The second time, probably not an accident, certainly not the third or fourth time. Once you know that something that you do is going to hurt people and cause them to die, you should be responsible for your actions and not do that. So the women did not sign up for this kind of sex. They certainly did not sign up to be choked repeatedly and brought back with CPR. But after the 4th woman, this all took place in 97 and 98, he decided to turn himself in. Now, this is highly unusual. I've never heard of another serial killer who turned himself in. And that is the reason why I decided to write the book. So I heard about the case. He was about to go into his death penalty portion of the case out in San Bernardino where he was tried. Since he was a trucker, he would pick up women up and down the state, and then he would do this stuff to them, and they would die. And then he'd transport them for miles someplace else and dump their bodies in waterways. So 2 of them were in the California aqueduct. One of them was in a ditch, and one of them, his first victim, whom he completely dismembered in his bathtub, he dumped her in Ryan's Slough, which is kind of a marshy, brackish area, and it eventually was like a river, and actually, I'm sorry, that's where she was found. He didn't dump her there. He dumped her in another place nearby, and the torso ended up in Ryan's Slough. One of her arms ended up at Clam Beach, which is where the waterway took through the currents, ended up dropping the arm. So, and that was some time apart that they found those 2 different parts of her, but they didn't know who she was because her head was missing. So the reason I wrote this update is because 25 years later, after he dismembered this poor young woman, and all they knew about her was that she was 25 years old, and approximately, and that she'd had a baby, which is kind of interesting, but apparently there was a portion of her down below that, I guess they can figure that out through where the baby comes through. Maybe it's bigger or something, because when you have a baby, I haven't had a baby, so I don't know all the details, but they were able to tell that this woman had had a baby. So that was pretty bizarre and interesting to me, because I'm still thinking, is that child alive somewhere that we don't know about? Does she even know she is? No, she can't. So anyway, 25 years later, she was identified by genetic genealogy by the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. But originally, when he turned himself in, he was 36, and he made national news because when he turned himself in, he had one of his most recent, the 4th victim, he had her breast in a baggie in his jacket pocket. And so that made national news. And so he ended up speaking to detectives, and the main detective from that area who had found this, who had been covering this case on what they called Torso Girl, that's all they had of her was the torso, he actually went back to the place where he had dumped her parts, her head, and parts of the rest of her under a chunk of cement near a cement plant where he worked and he worked there part-time. He lived in a trailer. But they were long gone. The parts were long gone. So he did try to help them identify her at the time when he was arrested, in addition to turning himself in. And because they had found other women in waterways, they do this, pattern of behavior to try to find like cases. They put out, bolos and stuff like that. Um, there were other detectives who came and interviewed him from the other places where they found these other victims. So 3 of them were identified, and I think 2 of the 3 were sex workers. One of them was kind of bordering on a sex worker, but she was a mom, and she was the kind of woman who would like take a cigarette and go talk to men in the street that were passing by in cars. She let the liquor store manager feel her up for $10. So even though she wasn't a sex worker, she was kind of out there. So he met her near a truck stop, picked her up, had sex with her. So again, these were women who were, I think he thought they were throwaway women that nobody was going to miss. And they weren't, because they're still somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, and somebody's sister. And in this case, this first woman who was dismembered, she had been missing. Her family had been wondering where she was. So, all these years later, the reason I updated this book is because I wasn't able to describe who she was, because I didn't know who she was. I wasn't able to interview her family because we didn't know who her family was. So anyway, all these years later, they took the tissue samples that they had originally taken from the arm and the torso, so that they knew that that was the same person, and they sent that off to the FBI to figure that out. And then they basically just had these tissues frozen all this time. And then there was a new sheriff in 2018 up in Humboldt County, where they ended up having like 65 of these cold cases dating back to the 50s, plus 20 cases of unidentified remains, including this woman. So they basically just said, well, we're going to do a website, and we're going to just start trying to solve these cold cases. Because up in Humboldt County, that's where they grow the pot. Now, before recreational cannabis was made legal, there were a lot of people up there growing pot and selling it on the black market. And so there were a lot of people in this kind of underworld that would be killed and were just left in the waterways, in the forest, and they'd find these bodies, and they didn't know who they were. So, but all they knew about this woman was the torso. They called her Torso Girl. And so the family was actually from Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. And the sister, Kathy Cummings, so this woman was identified. Her name is Carrie Ann Cummings. The sister, really was very close to her, and for years she would go away and then come back. So let me start from the beginning. When she was young, they were very close, but Carrie had some kind of learning disability. She just didn't test right. She just didn't really, she was smart, but she didn't do well in school. And so, and she had a speech impediment, so she couldn't fit in, and she was, made fun of by the kids. So her sister and she were very close. And as she grew older, she finally was getting better, and they realized she had artistic talent. So they sent her off to art school, and she started, making her own clothes and painting murals, and so that was her thing. But she didn't want to go to college. So she basically decided to, after high school, she did a couple jobs, worked with her sister at a restaurant, and then she just decided to go off. And she ended up hooking up with the Rainbow Gatherings. I don't know if you've heard of that. But basically, this is like a bunch of hippies that hang out in the forest, and they sit naked in the river and commune with nature and commune with each other and try to get away from the rest of the crazy world. And they do psychedelic drugs. So she got into psychedelic drugs. So she came back to stay with her sister every year for, a couple months or whatever, and then she'd go back out. Well, during that time, she ended up apparently getting pregnant, but her sister never knew. She had a boyfriend at one point. So anyway, she came back one time, close a couple of years before she went missing finally, and she had a breakdown, and she just, she was just hearing things, and she kind of stuck herself between the refrigerator and the wall, and she was cutting herself, and she just was not well. So they took her to see a psychiatrist, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So the thing about that is, though, some of these drugs that she was taking could have, in fact, been mimicking these symptoms. So it's hard for me to know whether she was really schizophrenic or whether she was just taking these drugs, which end up changing your brain and can cause similar symptoms. But the fact of the matter was, she was not right. Her mother and her sister had suffered from depression, and so they had been taking pharmaceuticals to deal with that. She did not want to do that. She wanted to stick with the street drugs. So she was not well, and so anyway, her parents were trying to get her to come live with them. She didn't want to. So right before she really finally went missing, her sister tried to get her to come back, said, I'll send you a bus ticket. Last time she talked to her, she was not doing well at all. She'd been sober for a while, but she just kind of fell apart again. They think she was on her way to stay with some friends of her parents. She didn't want to stay with her parents, but maybe this other family might have been okay. So they think she was on her way there when she ran into Wayne Allen Ford. So what we know now is she basically was hitchhiking. He picked her up, and she said, "Are you going to the beach? I'd like to go to the beach." Which ironically is where her arm was found, but that's not because he put her arm there. It's just ironic that that's where her arm ended up later. So her sister, who I interviewed for the book, basically said, yeah, I think, two people who were not right in the head found each other, and it's a shame. So she says, I don't hate this man, because clearly they both had mental problems, because he did. He clearly had mental problems. When I listened to his interview tapes, I have audio of listening to him, and also written transcripts of the interviews with all these detectives. You can tell he is not well. I have the booking video. Also, he's crying the whole time, and he's just not right in the head. And so, to me, when somebody's mentally ill, even if they kill people, I still don't see that as evil. I think they're sick. And so that's kind of where I come from. I don't put my opinions or my own feelings into my books, but I just am trying to explain what happened to this man and why these women ended up falling prey to him. I don't think he's an evil person. I think he's just really messed up. So he was diagnosed with borderline personality. I don't know if you are aware of what that's like, but I was married to somebody who had that. I didn't know that when I married him, but so basically very black and white thinking. They have difficulty separating themselves from somebody they're close to. They have like boundary issues. They're known to steal. They're known to act out. They're known to do a lot of crazy behavior. So I'm not sure how much of this might have been related to that, but that's not something that was his fault either. It's this personality disorder forms within the first 5 years of your life. So that probably had to do with his parenting. A lot of this stuff is parenting. So anyway, he also is an alcoholic, and he had chronic depression that could not have been treated. Even if he had taken medication, he still would have probably been depressed. So all of these diagnoses were made after he was arrested, I think. He was a sexual masochist, so he did these things to himself too. He hurt himself sexually, and somehow enjoyed that, and he liked torturing these women. The other thing was he had one woman who he did this to, but he let her go because she listened to him and his woes. So also at the time that this was going on, he saw himself as a victim to his recent divorce, and he has a son with the second wife. And he kept saying, she wouldn't let me see my son, which really wasn't true. He moved to another state, and he worked in this truck, and she lived in Las Vegas. And but in his mind, woe is me, I can't see my son, she's keeping me from seeing my son. So he was telling this young woman who was a prostitute, sex worker, I'm not supposed to say prostitute, sex worker, and because she listened to him, he tied her up and left her by the side of the highway. And we know what he did to these women because she testified at the trial. So I interviewed her as well for the book. and I used her real name because she gave me permission. Her picture's in here too if you want to see her. Her name was Rachel Holt. And she has since died because being a sex worker is a tough way to live. And she was pretty young too when she died. So, I mean, it's just tragic that these young women, you know, were treated like this by this man who, I'm not making excuses for him, but, you know, he did bad things to these women and to other women too. Because, you know, he did not have a high opinion of women either. So, but I think what was rewarding for me in writing this book and to doing the update was that if there's such a thing as a happy ending, at least this young woman has been identified. She has her name back. She's no longer a Jane Doe. She's no longer a torso girl. Her family now knows what happened to her. Because the sad thing was, they tried to report her missing to the Tucson police, but because they knew that she had been on drugs, they were identifying her and classifying her as, you know, voluntarily missing. And so they said that doesn't count. So they never put her in the databases. So she had a very unique tattoo with like a ring of roses, I think it was on her ankle. And if they had put that into a database someplace where her sister could have found it, they might have identified her much sooner. But instead, it's the only reason she was identified was because her cousin, who was into genetic genealogy with his sister, he got his DNA profile through one of these websites, and then he submitted it to another website called GED Match, which specifically you give your permission to use your DNA for law enforcement purposes to help solve crimes. Because these other websites, they solved the Golden State Killer case without anybody's permission, and that caused a big controversy. So now there is a specific place that if you want your DNA used for those purposes, you give permission. And so the sheriff's department in Humboldt County submitted her DNA profile to that website, and then they got a match with the cousin, who specifically submitted his DNA because his cousin was still missing, and he was hoping to get her identified, and so it worked, which is great. And eventually then they track him down, they call him up and they say, hey, you know, do you have a missing person in your family? He says, yes, my cousin. Does she have any other relatives? Yes, she has a sister. So they got the sister's email and phone number, and they called and left her a message, one of the detectives, and said, this is, you know, the sheriff's department out of Eureka in Humboldt County. We'd like to talk to you. And before she even answered the voicemail, she got online and she started Googling Eureka and missing person and, you know, the time frame. And she found news stories about Wayne Manafort, and she found my book. So she read my book 3 times before she called the detective back, and she said, that's my sister. She could tell that was her sister based on how she was described just in my book. So that made me feel good, because there's so many times I write these books and people just make all kinds of accusations about how I'm trying to capitalize on people's tragedies and, you know, how I'm making so much money off the, and no, I'm not. But I do this because I feel like it's important. You know, I do this kind of work to educate people and to help people understand, you know, what makes a sexual predator? How does somebody get like that? Because that's not something we like to talk about, but they're out there, and we need to know how to protect ourselves from these people, right, and our daughters. So anyway, so I interviewed, so that she called them back, and she says, yeah, you know, I think that's my sister. And they got her DNA, and then they were able to do an even closer confirmation, and they're like, yes. So they decide, yes, this is who this is. So then she was able to get her sister's parts back so that she could bury them on her property and be close to her sister again. So that's good too. So that's the main thing about this book. But I'm take some questions if you have any questions.
Is this guy still alive in jail?
He's still alive. Okay, so here's the situation in California. You may already know some of this. Gavin Newsom did not want to execute anybody, because he said there's enough problems with the system. There are enough innocent people who we know have been executed. It's socioeconomically biased towards, you know, people of color. More people are executed, and then, you know, so it's problematic. and he just doesn't believe in the system. So he put a moratorium on executions, which had already been stalled anyway because they found that the lethal injection was inhumane, and so they stopped it. So they were looking for a new way of doing it, a new chemical to use instead of the 3-shot protocol that they were using. I actually watched an execution. So the way they used to do it was they would give one shot to sedate you. The second shot, I might not get this right because it's been a long time, but one shot to, I can't remember, one stops your heart and one stops your breathing, I think. So finally, by the time you get the third shot, you're supposed to just die. But unfortunately, what they found out was that shot was causing people intense pain. Mm-hmm. So you're not allowed under the 8th Amendment to do cruel and unusual punishment. And so they found that using that 3-shot protocol was inhumane and was hurting these people, which you're not allowed to do. And you have to be well enough to be executed. So, I mean, there's a lot of rules about how you and when you can execute someone. So anyway, so Gavin Newsom put a stop to all that. So as long as he's still in office, there will be no executions in California. He also decided to dissolve death row, and so all these men were at San Quentin in single cells, and so he's basically eliminated that and redistributed all those inmates to other prisons in California. So he is now in San Luis Obispo. There's no longer a death row. So he's still on death row technically. He still has a death sentence that he's living under, but apparently he has more freedom there, and he's happier there, which is not what everyone wants to hear, but that's, Gavin Newsom believes in rehabilitation. And so, the next book that I was going to talk to you just a little bit about the next book just before I take questions. The next book that I have coming out in June, there's a guy who's also on death row, and he's now in R.J. Donovan prison down near me in San Diego. The book is called Down to the Bone, and it's coming out on June 24th. And it's about a family of 4 with 2 little boys who are 3 and 4 years old. And they lived in Fallbrook, California, which is in northeast San Diego County. And before that, they lived in San Clemente. So Joseph McStay, he was a surfer, and he made waterfalls that would hang on the wall, and for offices and for businesses and stuff like that. So he had an online waterfall manufacturing business. He'd sell them online. And he had a guy that he worked with who was a business associate who built the website and helped move up the company and the SEO on computers and, on Google. And then he had another guy, another business associate, who helped him make the waterfalls. So basically the way this case transpired, Joseph McStay and his wife Summer, they had these 2 little boys. They'd just moved into this house in Fallbrook, which they were remodeling because they couldn't afford to live near the coast because it was too expensive. So they bought a house in foreclosure, and they decided to, fix it up. And then once they fixed it up, maybe they could afford to move back to the coast. So I had these 2 little boys, really cute, and they were living in Fallbrook, and they'd only been there for a few months when suddenly they just disappeared. So they were in the news. This story was on the cover of People magazine. There have been a number of documentaries, most recently a 7-part documentary that ran on Investigation Discovery. If you're interested, it's called 2 Shallow Graves. Apparently, they got all the same discovery materials, so detective interviews, detective investigative reports, all the behind-the-scenes stuff. They didn't use any of it. I don't know why, but my book is full of stuff that's never been released publicly about the 2 investigations. So the first investigation was a missing persons investigation. So they just disappeared. Initially, the detective who wrote up the search warrant affidavit said that he thought they had been murdered. However, after that, apparently a judge did not believe that he had evidence to support that and would not approve any more search warrants, and therefore it remained a missing persons investigation and never proceeded to a homicide investigation, even though everyone said this was crazy. they wouldn't just leave without telling anyone where they were going. And there was like, eggs left out on the counter. They were in the middle of breakfast. And their dogs were left outside with no food or water, which they didn't do. They'd bring them in at night.
Book Carnival.
And Summer's prescription glasses were left out on the counter. Her favorite boots were in the house. So it just didn't really make sense that they had just voluntarily gone someplace else.
Let me check for
But
you.
3 years later, the detective who'd been working on the case decided there's nothing more I can do. They went to Mexico. That's where they are. And he dropped the case. Said he was giving it to the FBI, which never happened. 8 months later, a motorcyclist was out in the Mojave Desert near Victorville, found a little white bone, and he called in the authorities, and then they found 2 shallow graves with the whole family there, their skeletal remains out in the desert. And each of them had a big hole in the back of their skull. So they think that was caused by a blunt instrument, most probably a 3-pound sledgehammer that they found in one of the shallow graves. So ultimately, the business associate who made the waterfalls is the one who was convicted and is now on death row. The whole trial, pretty much by his defense, was that the other guy had the other business associate had the exact same motive, and yet was never even considered a suspect. So I don't take a position in terms of innocence or guilt on anybody's part, but I have all the backstory. I have all those detective investigative reports that they wrote, and the defense basically said this was a case of confirmation bias, which basically means you get some evidence that leads you to have a theory, and no matter what other evidence you get that doesn't support that theory, you will not move off that premise. And so in the first case, it was that they were missing and that they went to Mexico, so that detective, he wouldn't move off that. And he didn't ever suspect that the other business associate who had admitted to hacking into their email, who had been taking money from their accounts even before they had gone missing, as if he knew that they weren't ever going to discover it. All kinds of stuff, that there were all kinds of exhibits and bank accounts and all the numbers about how much money he ended up taking from the business and not sharing with the family members who were surviving. And then the next case, the next set of detectives in San Bernardino County who were now doing a homicide investigation, that they almost immediately settled on this other business associate, no matter what evidence they couldn't find to support that. So, for example, no blood or DNA of his could be linked to the house. They would not get off the premise that they were killed in the house, even though there was not even a tiny speck of blood found anywhere in the house. And if you have anything about head injuries, you hit somebody in the head and you have a big enough injury to leave a hole in the skull, there's going to be blood everywhere, and you can't hide that even with paint. So anyway, that book's coming out in June. Okay, so if you guys have any questions.
Is it giving it away? How many with the Torso Girl? Did they only have those 2 parts? Did they find any?
That's all they had.
So that's all they had.
They looked for
Yeah.
others. He took them to where he originally dumped the parts. They reconstructed a whole experiment with bags, straw bags, or whatever, to see where the current went, to see if they could find other parts and where they
But they
were
couldn't
gone, but they
find.
never found any others. But the thing about human tissue is, other parts of nature eat human tissue and other animals, and so who knows what ended up. And if it ended up in the ocean, people's bodies don't last. There are other creatures at work that, and the bones rub together and then they disintegrate. So that's a lot of what happened in Dead Reckoning. So Dead Reckoning was a case in Newport Beach where these 2 people who lived on a boat ended up being tied to their anchor and thrown overboard off Newport Beach. And so they looked for their bodies, but at 3,500 feet where they sunk, I don't think they even found the anchor. They were looking with radar and all kinds of stuff, so they never found their bodies. But after, like I said, after a few days, their bodies were gone.
Yeah, how was your experience when interviewing this guy? When after, did you
I
interview
did
him
not
when he
interview
was in
him. Actually,
prison?
he didn't want to. I interviewed his brother
Oh, he didn't
and
want
his
to.
father for a couple days, actually, in a hotel room. I had excerpts of 8 hours of interviews with his mother that the
Mhm.
defense investigator had done. So I had all this background material. Um, and I had his interviews with the police, these different sheriff's agencies, where he confessed all this stuff. So I didn't really need it. I didn't really need to talk to him
Mhm.
because he said so much that I don't know that I would have gotten anything different, to be
Yeah.
honest. And I don't know that he was lying necessarily, but killers tend to minimize their responsibility and things and accountability. But I originally wanted to call this book Killer with a Conscience because he did turn himself in.
Yeah,
He knew what he was
that's
doing was
unusual.
wrong. And he called his brother to help him make sure he turned himself in because he figured he was going to back out, which he then tried to do, but his brother was there. No, we're going. So, like I said, I interviewed his brother for a day and a half, and we're still in touch. So, it's totally. He feels he's very angry at his brother, and he's, he feels like they're very different people. And did you guys have any questions?
No, I mean, we came here like last minute. We were driving to
know.
San Diego. We were gonna actually go to Verbatim. I don't know if you're. But do you have your other books here, or is it just?
I'm not
this
sure.
one?
You can ask. Probably not because it's been a while, but they are all available online.
Okay.
And if you need a hard copy and you can't find one, because a lot of them are out of print, you can email me.
Oh, okay.
What caused you to start writing a book? Had you always, you're a journalist, so had you been writing for newspapers? And
Yes.
okay, and then how long ago did you decide? Do you still do newspapers, or are you do
Okay,
both?
so I started out when I was in college. I went to UC Berkeley, and I was a psychology major, and I had actually thought that I was going to become a therapist. But then I decided I have enough of my own problems. I don't want to listen to other people's problems all day long. But I took abnormal psychology, and so there were people like this who we were listening to tapes of, and we were learning about all this stuff. I took psychology of the brain, so I learned all kinds of stuff that was really interesting, and so that's really helped me understand. And when I was at the newspaper in San Diego, I worked in Massachusetts. I worked at the LA Times as a full-time freelancer, which was an illegal situation that they got in trouble for, but I did get some good experience there. I worked for the LA Daily News, and then I ended up at the San Diego Union Tribune. So I was an investigative reporter for almost 20 years. And while I was doing all that, I started writing a novel, a crime novel. I couldn't get it published. So the problem was that I had this desire to write a book and get published, but I didn't know enough of the right stuff for the material because I hadn't covered the true crime aspect. I was a government reporter. I covered incompetence and wrongdoing and corruption and stuff like that in government. That was what I did for the newspaper mostly. And over time, I started working on Saturdays and started doing the police beat. So then I started doing murders that way. And I just started really kind of, there's so much drama. There's nothing more at stake than life and death, that there's just people who are traumatized. And so I got really caught up in that. So my first book that I wrote is called Poison Love. And it was not the first book I wrote. The first book I wrote was called Naked Addiction, which is also out if you want to read fiction. That's based on just stuff in my brain. It's not based on any real case. But I am going to be having a new series of thrillers coming out starting in January. And I wanted it to be the same. It's the same detective as Naked Addiction, but there's so many years in between that I started a new series with a new female investigative reporter as a main character. And so now that I've done all these true crime books, now I know how detectives think, and now I know how they investigate murders, and now I know the stuff that I didn't know when I first tried to do it. But the only way that I could get published was to start writing these true crime books. So I started out always wanting to write crime fiction, but I just wasn't good enough at it. And so now I have a 2-book contract for thrillers coming out next year. The first one is coming out in hopefully January, and it's called Hooked. So anyway, they're a lot different than Naked Addiction because now I know what I'm doing. But these read like fiction. So I mean, they use the same storytelling techniques, but everything has to be true in these nonfiction books. I don't make anything up. Not that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that was very good.
Okay.
I had a question
Sure.
about this character that
Uh-huh.
you originally wrote. Obviously, a lot of work goes into making sure everything is true that you
Yes.
write. I was just curious, did he father any children?
Mhm.
And what
Yeah, when
was,
he got divorced, he had a son that he was complaining he couldn't see. His name is Max, and he was 6 at the time. That was a long time ago. So the guy's probably 30 by now. I don't know.
and I guess it may or may not have an answer. Was there any danger or any episodes with that person that this type of addiction would carry through?
Not that I know of. No, I mean he did things with his 2 wives. You know, asked them to do things, and they did things with him sexually that they were not comfortable with, and that's all I really know. I mean, there are probably some details in here. I haven't reread this book recently because I've been working on 4 thrillers and this next book that's coming out in June, and I've been seriously like working on 4 or 5 books at a time, and I can't keep all those details in my brain. But they're two. It's all in here. 2 marriages and a child. His whole life in Orange County was with the first wife, and she. I wasn't able to reach her, and she's dead now. But just on how he developed and evolved, but his whole family never thought that he was capable of doing this. They thought he was a polite, handsome, could sing as well as Elvis kind of guy, and so they were surprised when they found out. But he had a lot of kinky stuff. He slept with a lot of women and did not treat women well, and so if they weren't aware of that, maybe they didn't look hard enough. But he also, sought mental health treatment, didn't get it. He also didn't really try that hard, but he clearly needed treatment. So, does it answer
And
your
we get
question?
the pleasure of having you back with fiction.
If you carry Thomas and Mercer, I don't know if you do.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, I'd be happy to come back. Yeah, I mean, it's a series of, I'm writing number 4 right now. I'm just finishing number 4. It's been so much fun, and it's so much less traumatic and so much less stressful. And I do interviews. I want to make sure everything is right. Like the 4th one that I've been working on has all kinds of like snipers and helicopters and raids and joint raids with the FBI and the sheriffs, and so there's a lot of stuff that I still don't even know, but I have sources that I can call and interview. I'm like, well, what would happen in this situation? And then I called the next one, and then they completely disagree with the last law enforcement person that I interviewed. But in the end, and some of them are the ones that I've got in my other books, and so now they're my sources, and they're my beta readers, and so they basically tell me. I've got a guy who I've known and I've been working with on every one of these thrillers. I met him in Poison Love. That was my very first book. And then I've got another one who reads them all, who worked with me on Dead Reckoning and I'll Take Care of You. He was a homicide sergeant in the Newport Beach detective police department. So it's been fun. It's been a journey, so now I get to write fiction, which is what I originally set out to do.
Which gives you a lot more freedom.
A lot more freedom, and I never really wanted to make stuff up because there's nothing more strange than the truth.
And the
honestly.
real thing.
Any other questions?
So how many hours a day do you write? Do you have a schedule, or what's your life like?
Well, I can't really just sit and do nothing. I'm a workaholic, but I don't write all the time because my brain only does editing and writing for a certain part of the day, and then I kind of just don't have any more brain power or bandwidth. So I'll do other tasks. So there's a lot to being an author. It has nothing to do with writing. So there's all kinds of promotions you have to do. You have to be on social media. I do a lot of podcast interviews on other people's podcasts, not my own. TV interviews, radio, blogs, Q&As online. There's all kinds of stuff that you have to do. Book signings, and then you have to set all that up and planning. And then, I do a lot of walking around the block when I'm writing fiction, and I'm like, I'm stuck. What am I going to do? What would happen? So I go take a walk around the block and swim and do stuff like that. But yeah, I watch a lot of stuff on Netflix and Apple and to get ideas, and it's kind of like my brain's always working. I can't shut it off. So I kind of work all the time because thinking is part of writing.
Yes.
Believe it or not.
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't have a routine, which is nice. So I quit newspapers in 2006 after 20 years. So that was enough. And I'm really happy that I'm not a journalist now because
Yes.
I don't know. They're all rules have changed. In fact, there aren't any rules, and I can't believe anything I read anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a sad state of affairs. I keep hoping for the boomerang effect that we're going to go back. People are going to get sick of it, and we're going to, it's already happening. We've got some nonprofit journalism outfits starting up, and I'm hoping we can get past whatever we're in right now because it's chaos and total craziness. Which is why I try to write the truth. That's what I try to do, write the truth. But everybody has their own version of truth.
But it's even more fun to write fiction that you can have the characters do what you want them to do.
Yeah, I was just watching this Robert De Niro limited series on Netflix called 0 Day. Have you guys seen that? I thought it was really good. And I was so worried that it was going to have like an ending like what's actually happening right now instead of doing the right thing and have justice. So yes, I have my characters are way more ethical and do not cross lines the way that other people's characters, other authors' characters may be doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But I have actually ethical characters who follow rules and have values. And I'm not like a preachy person, but I just feel like some things, looking back, even just a little while to when journalists were ethical and police were ethical and we trusted the police. And that's where my thrillers are. They started in like 2015 when we still had newsrooms. We still had staffs and reporters who were actually out there doing a good job. And it's not like they don't do a good job now. There's just not enough of them to do anything, and that's the problem. They've just been decimated. So anyway, that's where that takes place. And I made up a sex drug, which is always fun.